All right, the Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Blessed Jesus, be with us this morning as we read through the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Send your Holy Spirit into our hearts and minds as we contemplate the Scriptures and inspire us in some way with the Word of God. All this we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so last week we read chapter 14 and we looked at the feeding of the 5,000, and the feeding of the 4,000 is actually in chapter 15 that we're going to read today, but we did look at it quickly. And we also looked a little bit at the Last Supper and some of the parallels there. Today, we're going to start with a video from the Yale professors that deals with feeding the hungry, and my assumption is that it deals with the two passages, feeding of the 4,000 and 5,000. And so we're going to jump to that if I can find a way to make sure this is big, because there it is. Okay. All right. Let me share my screen. Can you see Professor Attridge? Do you see him? You do. Okay. All right. So this is a 16-minute video, and by the end of this, my guess is the rest of our class will be here.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay.
Well, Michael, Beth, so far we've been through about half of the Gospel of Matthew, and last time we were talking about some controversy stories, healing stories, some prophetic texts, and then parables. All right. We move on now to some miracle stories that are fairly well known, particularly the feeding of the 5,000. And how does this one fit into the whole operation of Matthew's Gospel?
Well, we have, in the beginning of chapter 14, we have this actually fairly gruesome story of the beheading of John the Baptist, and that's right before the feeding of the 5,000. I think it can seem sort of jolting a little bit, but if you look closely, there are some really interesting connections between the story of the beheading and the miracle story, not least the fact that these are both, in a sense, feasts. So we have the beheading of John the Baptist at a banquet that Herod has put on. This is a banquet of elites that ultimately ends in death. And then we move into this miracle where Jesus publicly provides for these more common people who have not brought food for themselves. And I think this is also a foretaste of the Messianic banquet, where we have all through Jewish tradition, Hebrew scriptures, talk of someday there being this Messianic banquet where all people will gather and be fed, and not only be fed, but in abundance. So we have this abundance that results from Jesus's miracle, and that's contrasted with the death that comes at the end of Herod's banquet. And these are sort of juxtaposed in the way that Matthew tells his story.
That is fascinating, isn't it? Sort of a not so subtle critique of contemporary social and political power, contemporary first century social and political power that stands as the antithesis of what the kingdom of God is all about, right? Do you see Matthew as having a kind of political or social critical dimension, or is this very, very subtle?
I think it is subtle, but it's there. Matthew is clearly writing within a situation of empire. The Roman Empire is in control. Herod is a Jewish king, but he rules on behalf of the Romans. The Romans really are the ones who put him in power.
Which Herod is this, by the way?
This is Herod Antipas. So this is the son of Herod the Great, who
we met back in the
beginning of the gospel, right? Exactly. So the danger of the Herods continues on through that line, and I think if we understand the political context where the Herodians are ruling on behalf of the Romans, we can understand that Matthew's context or the first century context is really politically charged. And so Jesus coming as this new king, which is how Matthew portrays him, would be subtly a critique of the kings who actually are in power, or the emperors, those who rule.
And we do hear as characters in the story about the Herodians later on in league with priests and Pharisees and the like in opposition to Jesus. And so that would point in this political direction. How about the situation contemporary with Matthew's writing in the 80s? Any Herodians around then?
Not that I know of. Are you referring to something specific?
Yeah, well, they're around, but playing a very minor role.
Right.
They certainly played a role during the Jewish revolt, and were supporters of Roman hegemony throughout. So, insofar as they're still on the scene, they're still part of the Roman imperial structures.
They're part of the mix,
but they're not ruling there in Israel-Palestine.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Matthew makes use of the Old Testament all over the place, right? We've seen that before. Are there allusions to Old Testament motifs here in the feeding story?
There are. And actually some of this ties in, again, with that political sort of dimension or the idea of rulers, because some have pointed out connections between this passage and Ezekiel 34, where there's this critique of the rulers of the people of Israel who are feeding themselves rather than feeding, the sheep, the people over whom they are supposed to be ruling on God's behalf. So there's that sort of implicit, subtle critique of those who feed themselves instead of feeding the sheep of God's people. Probably more prominent are connections with Moses. So Moses provides for the people of God in the desert with the manna. We know this familiar story. And there was an expectation that the manna would return, would come back. So there's this connection with bread, with provision, God's provision for God's people. And again, we've spoken about Matthew's Jesus being, in a sense, a new Moses. So I think we have those sort of resonances as well.
And the Moses stuff and the manna in the desert motifs will be picked up in the Gospel of John when it tells the same story and exploited massively. Yeah.
Right.
So they might be lurking in the background. Are there any allusions to Christian ritual practice, to Eucharistic meals?
Yeah, I think that this is really a foreshadowing of the Eucharistic meal at the end of the Gospel. We have these details of Jesus, the emphasis on the bread, breaking the bread, giving thanks, taking, giving. This sort of language shows up again at the Lord's Supper. So I think it's not only a foretaste of the Messianic banquet on a sort of grand eschatological scale, but also of that Christian ritual practice that many of us continue to celebrate today.
And again, thinking about Matthew as the gospel of the church, and here seeing the church as an alternative society focused on this act as opposed to the acts of exploitation and violence.
Right.
Yeah, interesting point. And the disciples play a major role here, right? They're supposed to be distributing. What's going on with that?
I think this picks up on what we saw, especially in chapter 10, where Jesus is sending his disciples out to imitate him, to participate in the inbreaking of the kingdom. Jesus is very focused on inviting others, as we've said, inviting others into the work that he does and into God's plan. I think it's interesting that here in Matthew, he uses what the disciples have. And John, it's a boy who has the loaves and the fishes. But here, it's the disciples' own resources that Jesus then multiplies and uses to provide for the people. So he uses their resources. He also asks them to participate in the giving. And then, of course, they pick up all of the leftovers at the end.
Yeah, and he gives a count at the end, right, of how many people participated in the grand picnic. 5,000 apart from women and children.
What's children.
The reference to women and children? Right. Were they not there, or is he slighting them, or what?
No, I think they were there. And, it's very common at that time not to count women and children. If you're making a count of something, you count the men. In Matthew's gospel as a whole, they don't show up as much as in Luke's gospel, for example. And Matthew has sort of been criticized for that. And another example is how in the birth narrative, Matthew focuses on Joseph's experience rather than Mary's.
Very different from Luke, right?
Very different from Luke, exactly. But I do think that women play an important role in Matthew. As we've said, they show up in the genealogy, which was not unprecedented, but it was unusual. We also have some pretty strong women. We have the Canaanite woman who, pushes back against Jesus on behalf of her daughter. We have the healing of the daughter of Jairus, the hemorrhaging woman, the woman who anoints Jesus later on in the gospel, despite others' objections. And then, of course, the women who go to the tomb and
a very important role.
A very important role, right. So,
and interestingly enough, in Luke, that role is marginalized, right? Yeah, it's just a report about women.
Right, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Well, there were two feeding stories. There's the one in 14 and the one in 15. Slightly different numbers are involved. Why two of these stories?
Why two? Well, this is common in Matthew's gospel, this dualism. He likes to repeat things. He likes the number two. This shows up quite a bit. There are two blind men, later on we'll see there are two animals in the triumphal entry, for example, and he repeats several stories.
And Jesus riding both of them.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I think this is a common strategy in Matthew's storytelling, but it also has an important function because it reinforces the themes that he establishes the first time around. So again, we have this reinforcement of God's provision, God's abundance, Jesus's role in enacting the kingdom of heaven, and the disciples' participation in that. But then the differences are interesting as well. In the first version of the story, or the first feeding, we have this reference to 12 baskets left over. In chapter 15, it's 7 baskets left over. And some have seen symbolism there that this could reflect what we discussed before, the two stages going first to the people of Israel, represented by the number 12, the 12 tribes of Israel, and then to Gentiles, the number 7, representing wholeness and perfection and entirety. So perhaps the Gentiles are being subtly incorporated into the people of God through Matthew's symbolic use of numbers. So that may be what's going on. I think for me, part of what's interesting here is the literary strategy of reinforcement through repetition, and then also the fact that the disciples don't remember what happens. It comes off kind of strange because it happens so quickly in the telling of the tale, so quickly after the first time, that you would think that they would say, oh, we just saw him do this, of course he can do it again. But they don't. And again, that's another theme I think we'll talk more about later, but this theme of the disciples starting to understand and then not quite getting it. So that also is incorporated in the way Matthew tells the story.
There's another example of something like that in the walking on the water. Jesus does, right. And then Peter kind of sort of does, but doesn't. Right, so what's going on there?
Right. Yeah, Jesus comes walking out on the water, and Peter says, if it's you, Lord, ask me to come out to you. And that language of if is interesting. It's shown up in Matthew before in somewhat negative senses. The devil tempts Jesus in the wilderness. We didn't talk about that part, but again and again he says, if you are, then show, then prove it. Later it shows up on the cross, if you are, then prove it. So is that what Peter's getting at? Is testing Jesus? I don't think so. And the reason is because Jesus then does say, come. So he says, if it is you, then tell me to come. And Jesus encourages him. He says, come. So I think that that Jesus is encouraging Peter to take that step of faith, which of course would take great courage. But then it says when he takes his eyes off Jesus and looks at his circumstances and he sees the wind and he sees what's going on, that's when he sinks. So it is that picture of faith and understanding, but it doesn't quite last.
Yeah, right. I want to focus on Peter before we conclude, and skip ahead just a little bit, because in the next chapter, chapter 16, we have the famous confession at Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus' response, where he tells Peter that he's the rock on whom the church is going to be built. Mm-hmm. Is Peter being made the first pope here?
Well, I'm Protestant, so the answer is no. You may disagree with me on that, but no, I don't think so. I think that Peter is a representative for the other disciples within the story, but then also more broadly in the church and in Christian community. And I'll give you one sort of detailed reason that I think that it's not just about the person Peter here. And that's that the language that's used in chapter 16 about the binding and loosing, Jesus gives him authority. That language shows up again in chapter 18. And those are also the two places that we get mention of the word that we translate church, ecclesia. In chapter 18, the you is plural. So the language is not specifically just geared toward Peter in that passage. So that's part of why I think it's not just about Peter being, set up as the first pope, which I know many Catholics.
It certainly is the Catholic tradition. I don't think that's the case in the first century. I do think that Peter is kind of being portrayed as a chief rabbi, because someone has to make the halakhic calls, right? What do you serve at the potluck? Okay. Well, I think this has been an interesting conversation about the feeding and its abundance and the way in which that fits into Matthew's vision for the church.
Unmute. All right. I like that. Somebody's got to make the call. That was pretty good. So, okay. We are going to jump in as soon as I can figure out how to. There it is. We're going to jump into chapter 15. Any comments or questions on our professor friends? Barbara? Yeah.
When she said, she kind of threw me back when when he asked her, well, is Peter the rock upon which the church is to be built? And she smiled and said, no, I'm a Protestant. And that, I obviously completely clueless, because I thought we were created after Henry VIII wanted a divorce. And I never knew the religious significance of she said it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's there. That's one of those, we're going to read it today, I think, but if you go to St. Patrick's Cathedral, you will see, I bet I can dig this up right now. Do you want to know what the crest of the Roman Catholic Church is? Yeah, I'll show it to you. Here you go. Share. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Right there. What are those? Those are giant keys, right? So that's that passage is that we're going to read about the keys and what have you is I mean, this is a whole other route to go down, but the history of the papacy and the Bishop of Rome becoming the only, as opposed to one of the patriarchs, starts really pretty early. But you can't just do something in the church. You need to defend it scripturally, right? So on this rock, I give you the keys. That sort of thing becomes, well, I'm the successor of St. Peter. And the arguments against that have been what she said, which was, well, that's fine, but he's a representative. And even if he's the first among the apostles, there's still other apostles. The other answer has been just because Peter, that was said to Peter, does not make it in line with everybody after Peter. But the Reformation, so Henry VIII fits into this vaguely latish. The Reformation comes along around when he's around, but the arguments for a lot of that were going back before that. And the schism between the Orthodox churches and the Catholic Church is, I'm gonna get the year on this correct if I'm gonna say it. It was in what year was it? 1054 is the Great Schism. And that's when, depending on your perspective, but that's when the Pope basically says, I'm no longer the first among equals of the patriarchs. I'm the first. And the other patriarchs say, we've always given you credit that you're sort of, but we're equals. And they walk their different, there's other reasons, but that's a lot of it. And it's related to all sorts of things. But the history of it goes back. And so when we do read some of these scripture passages, in everything, I mean, in every aspect of Christian faith and practice, if people are going to do it or not do it, they start mining the scriptures for not exactly proof texts, but things that support their point, right? So
I'm a lawyer.
Yeah. Well, if it's not in there, you've got a much harder argument, right? But if it's in there, well, I'm making my case because it's right here. And I thought it was interesting. When she was talking about the if then things, right? The Peter and the devil and the cross and all that. And I had never noticed those things. So that was nice to hear her say that with the if. I hadn't compared them to the other places. But it is interesting that as long as he's focused on Jesus, he's fine. But once he stops, he sinks. So yeah, well, we'll see if we have any. Did we read that chapter? No, it's in the next chapter, the Peter. But pay attention to some of Peter's stuff as we go on, and you'll see there is. I mean, we read on Sunday the feed my lambs, tend my sheep thing, right? And that. From John, that's another one that's used. Oh, well, so he's the one that's singled out. So he must be the one that's in charge. He's the vicar of, while the shepherd is not there, Peter is the one that gets to take over. And those passages are used depending on your perspective, right? I would never, I'm an Episcopalian. I would never preach on, see, this shows the Pope's authority. I also would not preach against that. Like, it's not even on my radar. Right? So, but in a Catholic church, that will sometimes get singled out as, and of course, this is the line where Peter becomes the Pope, right? And that sort of thing. Yeah. All right. Any other things before we jump in? All right. Alban, can you read? I'm going to share my screen. Can you read the first whole passage? Rulers from the elders. You're going to have to unmute, though.
Okay. Rulers from the elders. And Pharisees and legal experts came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, why are your disciples breaking the elders' rules handed down to us? They don't ritually purify their hands by washing before they eat. Jesus replied, why do you break the command of God by keeping the rules handed down to you? For God said, honor your father and your mother, and the person who speaks against father or mother will certainly be put to death. But you said, if you tell your father or mother, everything I am expected to contribute to you, I'm given to God as a gift, then you don't have to honor your father. So you do away with God's law for the sake of the rules that have been handed down to you. Hypocrites. Isaiah really knew what he was saying, what he was talking about when he prophesied about you. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far away from me. Their worship of me is empty, since they teach instructions that are human rules. Jesus called the crowd near and said to them, "Listen and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that contaminates a person in God's sight. It's what comes out of the mouth that contaminates the person." Then the disciples came and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees were offended by what you just said?" Jesus replied, "Every plant that my heavenly Father didn't plant will be pulled up. Leave the Pharisees alone. They are blind people who are guides to blind people. But if a blind person leads another blind person, they will both fall into a ditch." Then Peter spoke up. "Explain this riddle to us." Jesus said, "Don't you understand yet? Don't you know that everything that goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? But what goes out of the mouth comes from the heart, and that's what contaminates a person in God's sight. Out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murders, adultery, sexual sins, thefts, false testimonies, and insults. These contaminate a person in God's sight. But eating without washing hands doesn't contaminate in God's sight.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Waldman. So I think it's helpful with what our two professors just said, which is that there are, if you remember back, they talked about the feast where John the Baptist was beheaded and compared that with the feast of the feeding of the 5,000. We're one chapter removed, but we're still dealing with issues around eating and things like that and events of that sort. We're going to see in a second that with this Canaanite woman story, how a person is invited to something or not invited to something versus, sort of insider outsider kind of things. But I think that this story about eating, or this teaching back and forth about eating and not eating and washing hands and out of the, it's not what comes in, but what goes out that is the issue, is I think Jesus is using as an opportunity these different gatherings, eatings, whatever, to sort of illustrate when people are kind of on the right path versus the wrong path. Herod obviously was on the wrong path, and it looks like at this point that the Pharisees are too, because they're so obsessed about what goes in and how it's prepared and your whether your hands are washed or not, that they're forgetting that it's how they act that actually matters. Any thoughts on that? Wish I could see everybody. I can't see everybody anymore. There we go. Now I can see everybody. Okay. Barbara, can you read the Canaanite woman? You got to unmute to do it.
From there, Jesus went to the regions of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from those territories came out and shouted, "Show me mercy, son of David. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession." But he didn't respond to her at all. His disciples came and urged him, "Send her away. She keeps shouting out after us." Jesus replied, "I've been sent only to the lost sheep, the people of Israel." But she knelt before him and said, "Lord, help me." He replied, "It is not good to take the children's bread and toss it to dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall off their master's table." Jesus answered, "Woman, you have great faith. It will be just as you wish. And right then her daughter was healed.
Great. Okay. Keep going. Read the healing of many people.
Jesus moved on from there along the shore of the Galilee Sea. He went up a mountain and sat down. Large crowds came to him, including those who were paralyzed, blind, injured, and unable to speak, and many others. They laid them at his feet, and he healed them. So the crowd was amazed when they saw those who had been unable to speak talking, and the paralyzed cured, and the injured walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel.
Okay, great. So this scene is strange, to say the least. Jesus is not very nice to her, and I'm sure lots of sermons have been preached on this and what have you. It is a turning point in the gospel narrative where Jesus shifts his ministry from just to the Jews to the non-Jews as well. And interestingly, it seems to be in large part hinged on this woman coming who is a Canaanite. And she, it's worth noting, she speaks to him with a title that is actually proper. If you go all the way back to the beginning of St. Matthew's Gospel, if you remember, the genealogy and the story of Joseph went very specifically to talk about Jesus as a son of David. So this is something that's come up before. And so she has a very specific request. She identifies him correctly. It may not be a full-throated, you are the Messiah, but it's not rabbi. It's not, it's son of David. And she wants her daughter to be healed. And when he says no, she presses him, which is interesting. And she is commended for having great faith. And right afterwards, it's not absolutely clear. They move back to the Sea of Galilee. So Sidon and Tyre are up on the coast. And actually, let me see if I can get a map. Can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Map of Israel. Jesus. Let's try that. That'll work. Okay. Can we see this? Okay. So Sea of Galilee is right here. You see Tyre? Tyre's right there. So he's moving around somewhere between here and here. And the woman, I think, did he come from Tyre? Yeah, so Jesus is in the regions of Tyre and Sidon. So he goes up here, and then he comes back down, and there's Chorazin, there's these other places that we've been talking about. But there's Sidon way up here, okay? So he's up here, and then he comes back down. But the idea is that he's now in non-Jewish territory for the most part, right? It's or he's in an area where non-Jews would be more prevalent. And so first this Canaanite woman is there, and then he goes back down. But I think this is a sign that this group of people that was healed are non-Israelites, because they're praising the God of Israel, right? Which seems redundant if they are Israelites, right? Normally it would just be, and they praised God. So I think that this is an indicator that this particular healing comes off of this conversation where he heals one person, and now he heals a whole bunch of people that are not necessarily Jewish. And when we get to the feeding of the 4,000, that also is generally thought of as being a feeding story for Gentiles and not for Jews. So this is a big shift that's gone on here. And it also, I think, plays into this idea. Do you remember what we read on Sunday from, or actually it's for this coming Sunday? This coming Sunday, we'll read in Acts the dream that Peter has, and he goes to Cornelius, and he ends up converting all these Gentiles and eating with them, and then he comes back and he gets yelled at by the other Christians who criticize him for hanging out and eating with Gentiles, right? This is the same thing as what's going on with the Pharisees. They're mad because the disciples don't wash their hands. They get really mad when they start eating with the wrong people as well, right? Tax collectors and this and that. And now Jesus is not only healing non-Jews, but he's also now feeding them and eating with them. So this would be a bringing in, I think, of a much larger group of people. Charlotte, can you read the feeding of the 4,000 since I've been talking about it? You're going to have to unmute, though.
Now Jesus called his disciples and said, I feel sorry for the crowd because they have been with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. I don't want to send them away hungry for fear they won't have enough strength to travel. His disciples replied, where are we going to get enough food in this wilderness to satisfy such a big crowd? Jesus said, how much bread do we have? They responded, 7 loaves and a few fish. He told the crowd to sit on the ground. He took the 7 loaves of bread and the fish. After he gave thanks, he broke them into pieces and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Gave them to the crowds. Everyone ate until they were full. The disciples collected 7 baskets full of leftovers. 4,000 men ate, plus women and children. After dismissing the crowds, Jesus got into the boat and came to the region of Magadan.
Great. Okay, let's see if we could find Magadan on a map. Okay, let's try. This is annoying. There we go. Magadan, Israel map. There we are. It's on the Sea of Galilee. Okay, you see it right here? Let's see if we can see it here. Magdala, that may be the same basic place. So this is in the same general vicinity over here, not all that far off from where the feeding of the 5,000 takes place, but the indicators seem to show that this is a feeding of Gentiles. The details are similar. It is funny, the professors noted this, that like this just happened, right? So the disciples are like, how are we going to feed all these people? And once again, and I thought it was a good point that the very small amount of food, again, this time it's still 7 things. Last time it was 2 and 5. This time it's 7 loaves and a few fish. But the very small amount of food that is there comes from the disciples, and Jesus multiplies their minimal resources into something far more amazing, which could parallel things like some of those parables where, a seed turns into something that bears fruit 100 times or something like that. And then anyway, they end up in eating and they collect 7 baskets full of leftovers, and 4,000 people eat, and you get a parallel of the feeding of the 5,000, but this time to Gentiles. I noted last time that in the feeding of the 5,000, he blesses the bread. This time he gives thanks. So you get both of those Eucharistic words. As one of the professors noted, he gave thanks, he broke the bread, he gave them to the disciples. This is the exact same language that we get Sunday after Sunday after Sunday from the words of institution from the Last Supper, and where Jesus either gives thanks or blesses and then breaks and then gives. And so there are some pretty clear Eucharistic imageries here. And it would indicate that when the church, I think it would indicate that when the church forms as you move forward, the worship of the church is not just for Jewish people that are following Jesus, but also Gentiles who follow Jesus as well. And so that everybody is able to participate in this. Any questions or comments on this? All right, let's see if we can jump to 16 and maybe get this. How long is 16? It's not that long. I think we can read 16. Alban, can you read demand for a sign? You got to unmute though, otherwise it's not going to sound very good.
The Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus. In order to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. But he replied, "At evening, you say, it will be nice weather because the sky is bright red. And in the morning, you say, there will be bad weather today because the sky is cloudy. You know how to make sense of the sky's appearance, but you are unable to recognize the signs that point to what the time is. An evil and unfaithful generation searches for a sign, but it won't receive any sign except Jonah's sign." Then he left them and went away.
All right. Yep, keep going. Keep going. You might as well keep going.
When the disciples arrived on the other side of the lake, they had forgotten to bring bread. Jesus said to them, "Watch out and be on your guard for the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." They discussed this among themselves and said, "We didn't bring any bread." Jesus knew what they were discussing and said, "You people of weak faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you don't have any bread? Don't you understand yet? Don't you remember the 5 loaves that fed the 5,000 and how many baskets of leftovers you gathered? And the 7 loaves that fed the 4,000 and how many large baskets of leftovers you gathered? Don't you know that I wasn't talking about bread? But be on your guard for the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Then they understood that he wasn't telling them to be on their guard for yeast used in making bread. No, he was telling them to watch out for the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees.
Great. Okay. These are two different things about faith. This is ironic if you've just read what we read, right? He just fed 4,000 people, which might be considered a sign. I believe in the gospel according to St. John, the same thing happens, that there's a controversy right after Jesus feeds 5,000 and they demand a sign. And it's like, he just did this. And so they're demanding a sign. I'm guessing the sign from heaven that they want might be something along the lines of a star, maybe, which we saw at the beginning of the gospel, right? So there already was one about Jesus, or maybe it's something like what we saw in Isaiah when the sun went backwards. If you remember that at one point in like chapter 30 something, when the sun goes backwards in Isaiah as a sign to Hezekiah. And basically he says, no, I'm not going to give you a sign. And it's because they can already read they already can make sense of the skies, but he's already just done something. So they're asking for proof is unnecessary, to say the least. Any idea what the sign of Jonah might be? Anybody? Not a clue. Okay. It could be a couple of things. The sign of Jonah could be a link to the resurrection, right? Jonah's in the whale for 3 days. Jesus is in the tomb for 3 days. It could be that that Jonah went and though he was unwilling to, he eventually got and prophesied to the people of Nineveh who were not Jewish, and the people of Nineveh all embraced his prophecy and believed. So it could be that. It's not clear, I don't think, what the sign of Jonah is right here, but it comes up a couple of times. And so if you have any guesses, let me know. But those are the two that I've heard of, is that it's if it's Nineveh or if it's the 3 days in the whale, and that sort of thing. It could also be that that if you remember Jonah, he gets mad at one point and he sits under under a tree that grows up overnight, and then he gets happy at the tree, and then the tree dies, and he's mad again, and God tells him that maybe he shouldn't be so mad at God's mercy and that sort of thing. So it could be that too. But my guess is it's probably a mix of the 3 days in the well, looking ahead to the crucifixion, but probably more so that the mercy of God is for all people. Okay, then there's this yeast, and basically it's using yeast to compare it to teaching, but I still think it's pretty funny that now they're out of bread. The disciples are kind of somewhat bumbling at this point, and they don't really get what's going on. But any comments on this section? All right. This is what we've been waiting for. So let's read Peter's declaration about Jesus. And Barbara, you might as well read it since.
Now, when Jesus came to the area of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the human one is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. He said, and what about you? Who do you say that I am? Simon Peter said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Then Jesus replied, happy are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because no human has shown this to you. Rather, my Father who is in heaven has shown you. I tell you that you are Peter, and I'll build my church on this rock. The gates of the underworld won't be able to stand against it. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Anything you fasten on earth will be fastened in heaven. Anything you loosen on earth will be loosened in heaven. Then he ordered the disciples not to tell anybody that he was the Christ.
Great. Okay, so you get a couple of the human one is the Son of Man. This is how this Bible translates that out. So you get the human one is the Son of Man. He identifies himself as the Son of Man. There's a couple of secondary identities that are all looking backwards in some way. And then he asks, but what about you? And it's Peter who gives the full-blown confession. Christ is the same word as Messiah and Son of God. So you get Jesus identifying himself as the Son of Man, Peter identifying him as Christ and also as Son of God. And this is an accurate description of who Jesus is. And as we read the next passage, we'll get a clarification of what that means, right? The titles are now correct, but what does it mean that he's the Son of God? What does it mean that he's the Christ? And we get a couple of this famous section that we talked about earlier, where Peter is the rock. His name literally means rock, but he's the rock that the church will be built on. And that keys that we saw earlier from the crest is where that comes from, is that the keys of to the kingdom of heaven are given to Peter. And this is, for what it's worth, when the Catholic Church has made a position, a statement on something through the Pope, the papal encyclicals and things like that, this is the background on what generally gets quoted, that the successor of Peter is either loosening or fastening something, right? And so what's interesting about that, this is outside of our tradition, obviously, so I don't want to weigh too far into this, but what is interesting about that is when the Pope speaks from the seat of Peter and actually makes like an official papal, I'm the vicar of Christ in Peter's, seat statement, it's really hard to undo that because it means that once it was fastened or loosened, you can't change that. So they tend not to do that all that often. But as an extracurricular activity, if you wanted to go and look into some of the things that have been said, I think they're called apostolic statements or what have you. But if you want to go look into some of the statements around that, you'll see, I think the Immaculate Conception is one that was, that's that Mary was conceived without sin. That it's not about Jesus, it's about Mary. There's some others that are like that too, but that's where this comes from is the background on that. Any comments on that? We have a different tradition. So for better or for worse, our way of doing things is a little different. All right. Charlotte, can you finish this chapter off and read the 21 to the end? The first part will be a clarification of what it means to be the Christ and a little bit of backtracking for Peter, and then a little more about what discipleship means.
From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he had to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders, chief priests, and legal experts, and that he had to be killed and raised on the third day. Then Peter took hold of Jesus and scolding him, began to correct him. God forbid, Lord, this won't happen to you. But he turned to Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. You are a stone that could make me stumble, for you are not thinking of God's thoughts. You're not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts. Saving and losing life. Then Jesus said to his disciples, all who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them, but all who lose their lives because of me will find them. Why would people gain the whole world but lose their lives? What will people give in exchange for their lives? For the human one is about to come with the majesty of his Father and his angels, and then he will repay each one for what that person has done. I assure you that some standing here won't die before they see the human one coming in his kingdom.
Okay, great. So the human one again is the Son of Man, just so you know. And this is the beginning of, I don't think we've gotten much of this second coming apocalyptic stuff yet. Have we gotten a lot of that or not much? So we'll get a lot more of that as the gospel moves along. One of the features of the Son of Man in all of the gospels is there's very much a sort of judgment, second coming, coming with the angels, straight out of the book of Daniel kind of view of the Son of Man. That can be hard to wrap your head around. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to it. But this is a taste of things to come, shall we say. This is about discipleship. All who come to me must deny themselves is usually what we get, right? Not say no to themselves, but take up their own cross and follow me. So following Jesus is a ministry of service and suffering, and basically being selfless as opposed to selfish. And Peter objects to Jesus as a Christ or Messiah who will suffer. And there's a funny play on this, right? Earlier, Peter, whose name is Rock, is the rock that the church is going to get built on. Now he's called Satan, and he's now a stone that Jesus will stumble on, right? So for what it's worth, we tend not to have this section in when things around the authority of the Pope get brought up. This section doesn't get brought up as much as the previous section does. But I think what it does is it gives you a good sense that Peter and the disciples are beginning to be on the right track, right? They've gotten the right idea that Jesus is, in fact, the Son of God and the Messiah, but they still can't wrap their heads around what that actually is going to mean. And this little note is, this is not in the actual scripture, but this is the first of what will be 3 predictions of how Jesus is going to die. And each one is followed by some sort of reaction about what that means. So somebody will in some way confess that Jesus is the Messiah or the Christ or something. Jesus will say, well, what this really means is I'm going to go to Jerusalem and suffer and die and be killed and rise on the third day. And in some way, shape, or form, there's a reaction usually against that. But I think we'll see as we go along that they begin to make progress. So the road of being a disciple sometimes is literally 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? So, but I think another thing that's really important is that it's not just Jesus it also has some meaning for his disciples. So if you're going to follow Jesus, it actually means in some real way following in his footstep and ministry. And he's going to take up a cross. What's interesting is there's no cross right here, right? But down here we get a cross. So this is looking ahead, at the very least, to the crucifixion. If you're a reader of this, you probably don't even notice this, right? You're like, oh, yeah, this is when he gets crucified, because you probably know the story. And you might not notice that there's nothing about cross or crucifixion there, but there is down here. So this is kind of meant to be read again and again and again and again and revisited. And so it's a switch from this is who Jesus is as the Christ to, and guess what? This means something for you as disciples. You're going to have to give up everything that you care about to follow Jesus and take up your own cross. And that's how you'll find true life. So there you go. Any questions or comments on that? All right. Stop sharing. So it was good to see you all. I've got another meeting in 2 minutes. So next week we will continue with chapter 17 and I'll send an email out next week and hopefully the rest of our class will show up. but we shall. I sent an email out last week. We had 8 people. I send no email this week. We have 4. But thank you all for coming. And we'll be on next week, moving through Matthew. All right.
Thanks, Matt.
Have a great week. I'll see you later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.